The old apartment building stood at the corner of 5th and Main, its red bricks faded and chipped from years of harsh winters and scorching summers. On the 3rd floor, in a small 2-bedroom unit that barely qualified as 1 bedroom, a 12-year-old boy named David sat cross-legged on his thin mattress, staring at a piece of cardboard spread across his lap. The cardboard wasn't just any piece of trash salvaged from behind the grocery store. David had spent hours drawing black and white rectangles on it with a permanent marker, creating what he called his piano. The keys weren't perfect. Some were slightly bigger than others, and the lines wobbled a bit where his hand had shaken. But to David, it was beautiful. It was his only connection to a world he desperately wanted to be part of. Outside his window, the sounds of the city created their own kind of music. Car horns blared in rhythm. The subway rumbled beneath the streets every few minutes, shaking the walls just enough to make the single picture frame on his dresser vibrate. Somewhere down the hall, Mrs. Rodriguez's television played too loudly, as it did every evening. David had learned to tune it all out. When he sat with his cardboard piano, the noise faded away, and he could hear something else entirely. He could hear real music in his mind. His mother wouldn't be home for another 3 hours. She worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3 when she could find weekend shifts at the diner on Parker Street. During the week, she cleaned office buildings downtown from 6 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. Then she rushed across town to work as a cashier at the discount supermarket until closing time at 10. David knew not to complain about being alone. He knew they needed every dollar she earned just to keep the lights on and food in their small refrigerator. The rent was always due. The landlord was never patient, and doctor's visits, even for his mother's bad back that kept getting worse, were a luxury they couldn't afford. But despite everything, David had discovered something that made him feel rich. Music. It started 2 years ago, completely by accident. His school had taken the 6th graders on a field trip to the Performing Arts Center downtown. Most of the kids complained about having to sit still for 2 hours and listen to classical music. They wanted to be outside playing basketball or hanging out at the park. But when David walked into that concert hall and saw the massive grand piano sitting in the spotlight on stage, something inside him woke up. The pianist that afternoon was a woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a long black dress and sat perfectly straight on the bench. When she began to play, David forgot how to breathe. The music poured out of that instrument like water from a fountain, cascading and flowing and filling every corner of the huge auditorium. It was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The melody seemed to tell a story without words. It made him feel things he didn't have names for. Joy and sadness mixed together, hope and longing intertwined. That night, lying in his bed while his mother snored softly in the next room, David couldn't stop thinking about the piano. He couldn't stop hearing the music in his head. The next day after school, instead of going straight home, he walked 14 blocks to the public library. The library became his second home. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, which was more than he could say about their apartment. But more importantly, it had something magical. It had free internet access and books about everything in the world, including music. David started simply. He checked out a book called Introduction to Reading Music and sat in the corner by the window, absorbing every page. The staff notes looked like a secret code at first, but slowly they began to make sense. Whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, treble clef and bass clef, sharps and flats. He copied everything into a notebook he had gotten for free during back-to-school supplies distribution. Then he discovered YouTube. On the library computers, which users could access for 1 hour at a time, David watched video after video. Piano tutorials, famous performances, lessons for beginners. He watched how the pianists moved their fingers, how they sat, how they used their whole body to create the sound. He took mental notes of everything, knowing he couldn't practice on a real instrument. That's when he got the idea for the cardboard piano. At first, he felt silly drawing it. What was the point of practicing on something that made no sound? But he remembered reading that many famous musicians had started with almost nothing. One article mentioned a pianist who practiced on a wooden table during the war because all the pianos had been destroyed. If that person could become great despite the circumstances, maybe David had a chance too. Every evening after finishing his homework, which never took long because the schoolwork was easy for him, David would pull out his cardboard piano and practice. He would look at the sheet music he had printed at the library or memorized from his books, and he would move his fingers across the silent keys. Press down, lift up. One finger, then another, his left hand learning the bass notes while his right hand danced through the melodies. His fingertips developed calluses from pressing against the rough cardboard. Sometimes his wrists would ache from holding position for so long, but he never stopped. Night after night, week after week, month after month, David practiced on his silent piano, building muscle memory for an instrument he had only touched once, briefly, during that field trip 2 years ago when the teacher wasn't looking. At school, nobody knew about his secret passion. David kept to himself mostly. He didn't have money for new clothes or the latest sneakers, and some kids made fun of the worn patches on his jeans, or the fact that he brought the same lunch every day. Peanut butter sandwiches were cheap, so he learned to be invisible, to slip through hallways without drawing attention, to eat lunch quickly and spend the rest of the period in the library. But one person noticed. Mr. Patterson, the music teacher, had seen something in David during the general music class that all students had to take once a week. While other kids goofed around during the lesson on rhythm and melody, David sat in the front row, leaning forward, absorbing every word. When Mr. Patterson played examples on the classroom's old upright piano, David's eyes never left the teacher's hands. One day, Mr. Patterson asked David to stay after class for a moment. David's heart raced, worried he had done something wrong, but the teacher simply asked, "Do you like music?" David nodded, not trusting his voice. Mr. Patterson smiled kindly and said, "I can tell. You have the attention of someone who really cares."
Have you ever thought about learning an instrument?
David's throat tightened. How could he explain? How could he tell his teacher that he thought about nothing else, that he dreamed about it every night, but that his reality made it impossible? Instead, he just shrugged and said quietly, "We can't afford lessons." The teacher's face fell with understanding and sympathy. He nodded slowly and didn't push further. But as David left the classroom, Mr. Patterson called out, "Keep loving music, David. Sometimes passion finds a way." That evening, David walked his usual route home from school. But as always, he took the long way, adding 15 minutes to his journey. Because the long way meant passing by Steinway Music Hall, the prestigious music school on Riverside Avenue. The building was beautiful, all glass windows and modern architecture. Through those windows, David could see the reception area with its glossy marble floors, the walls covered with photographs of famous musicians who had studied there, and if he timed it right, which he always did, he could stand on the sidewalk and watch the students through the large practice room windows on the ground floor, boys and girls his age, some younger, some older, sitting at real pianos with real teachers beside them learning to play. Their fingers moved confidently across the keys. They made mistakes and tried again. They created actual sound, actual music. David pressed his forehead against the cool glass, watching a girl about his age play something fast and complicated. Her hands flew across the keys, and even through the thick window he could hear the muffled sound of the music. What would it feel like, he wondered, to have someone believe in you enough to pay for lessons? To have a real piano to practice on instead of cardboard? To have a future where music was possible? A teacher inside noticed him watching and waved him away with an annoyed gesture, as if he were a stray dog loitering where he didn't belong. David stepped back quickly, embarrassed, and continued walking home. But even that small rejection couldn't crush the dream growing inside him. Somehow, someday, he would play a real piano. He would make real music. He just had to believe it was possible and keep practicing on his cardboard keys, building skills that nobody knew he had, preparing for an opportunity that hadn't arrived yet. That night, as sirens wailed in the distance and his mother finally came home exhausted from her long day, David sat on his bed with his cardboard piano and practiced scales one more time. His fingers moved with increasing precision, muscle memory building with each repetition. He didn't know it yet, but everything was about to change. An opportunity was coming that would test everything he had learned and force him to prove that talent doesn't require money, only dedication. But that moment was still days away, waiting for him at a charity event his mother didn't even know she would be working yet. Thursday evening arrived with unexpected news. David's mother came home earlier than usual, around 7 o'clock, which was strange. She usually didn't finish her supermarket shift until 10. David looked up from his homework, immediately worried. Had she lost one of her jobs? They could barely make it through the month as it was, but his mother's face didn't show the exhaustion he was used to seeing. Instead, she looked slightly nervous, maybe even a little excited. She set down her purse and sat beside him on the couch, the old springs creaking under her weight. "I got offered some extra work," she said, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "It's this Saturday night. They need additional cleaning staff for a big fancy event at the Grand Meridian Hotel downtown. The pay is almost double what I normally make for an evening." David nodded, understanding immediately what this meant. Extra money meant they might actually have a cushion this month. Maybe they could fix the bathroom sink that had been dripping for weeks, wasting water they paid for. Maybe his mother could finally buy the back brace she needed for her constant pain. "The thing is," his mother continued, looking a bit uncomfortable, "I know you usually stay home alone on weekend nights, and that's fine. But this event goes really late, probably past midnight, and I was wondering if maybe you'd want to come with me. You could bring your homework. There's a service area where the staff waits. You'd be safe there, and I'd feel better knowing where you are." David's first instinct was to say no. Spending Saturday night sitting in some back room at a fancy hotel while his mother worked sounded boring. But then he saw the hope in her eyes, the way she was trying not to pressure him but really wanted him to say yes. She worried about him being alone so much. This would give her peace of mind. "Sure, Mom," he said with a small smile. "I'll come." The relief on her face made his decision worth it. She hugged him quickly, something she didn't do often because she was always too tired or too rushed. "Thank you, baby. I promise it won't be terrible. Maybe you'll get to see how the rich people live, huh?" Saturday arrived faster than David expected. He spent Friday afternoon at the library as usual, studying more music theory and watching a documentary about famous pianists. One part stuck with him, a quote from some composer he couldn't remember the name of. "Music is the language of the soul, and everyone has a song inside them waiting to be played." David wondered what his song would sound like if he ever got the chance to play it for real. On Saturday evening, his mother made him wear his best clothes, which meant the khaki pants and button-up shirt he wore to school concerts. They were a bit too small now, the shirt sleeves ending just above his wrists and the pants hitting higher on his ankles than they should. But they were clean and pressed, and his mother said it was important to look presentable even if they were just staff. They took 2 buses to get downtown. The Grand Meridian Hotel was in a part of the city David rarely visited. Here the streets were cleaner. The buildings were tall and made of glass and steel reflecting the evening sky. People walked by in expensive coats, talking on phones that probably cost more than his mother made in a month. The hotel itself was breathtaking. The entrance had a red carpet leading up marble steps. Doormen in fancy uniforms with gold buttons stood at attention. Through the massive glass doors, David could see enormous crystal chandeliers hanging from ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky. But his mother led him around to the side entrance, the one marked service staff only. Here the glamour disappeared. The hallway was plain concrete, painted white with bright fluorescent lights humming overhead. They checked in with a manager holding a clipboard, who gave his mother her assignment and pointed David toward a small break room where he could wait. The break room had a few folding tables, old plastic chairs, and a vending machine that looked like it might not work. A small television mounted in the corner played the news with no sound. David set down his backpack with his homework and a book, settling into a chair near the wall. His mother squeezed his shoulder. "I'll check on you when I can, okay? There's a bathroom down that hall. Don't wander around. These fancy places don't like seeing people like us where we don't belong." David nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "Stay invisible. Don't cause problems. Be grateful for what little access you have." For the first hour, David tried to focus on his math homework. But his mind kept wandering. What was happening on the other side of those walls? What did a fancy charity event look like? He had seen movies with ballrooms and people in tuxedos, but were they really like that in real life? His curiosity eventually won. David knew he shouldn't, but he quietly left the break room and followed the hallway toward where he could hear music and voices. The corridor turned several times, leading him past storage closets and industrial kitchens where catering staff rushed back and forth with silver trays. Finally, he found a spot where he could see into the ballroom. He stayed back in the shadows near a service door, knowing he wasn't supposed to be there but unable to resist. The room was magnificent. Everything his mother had said about how rich people lived was right there in front of him. The ceiling was painted with angels and clouds like something from a museum. 5 massive chandeliers hung down, each one dripping with what must have been thousands of crystals that caught the light and scattered it like diamonds. Round tables covered in white silk cloth filled the room, each one decorated with tall flower arrangements that probably cost more than his family's monthly rent. But David's eyes locked onto something else entirely. In the center of the ballroom, positioned like a jewel in a crown, sat a concert grand piano. It was the most beautiful instrument he had ever seen. The wood was so black it seemed to absorb light, polished until it gleamed like still water. The lid was propped open, revealing the strings inside. Even from this distance, David could tell it was a Steinway, the same brand as the music hall he passed every day. This one was probably worth a fortune. People in elegant clothes moved around the room. Men wore tuxedos with bow ties. Women floated past in long gowns that rustled with each step, jewelry sparkling at their necks and wrists. They held champagne glasses and laughed with the kind of ease that came from never worrying about money. They belonged here. They owned spaces like this, while David could only steal glimpses from the shadows. An older man in an especially expensive tuxedo stood near the piano, greeting guests. He had silver hair swept back from his forehead, and a watch that caught the light every time he moved his wrist. People seemed to defer to him, waiting for him to speak first, laughing extra hard at his jokes. David figured he must be someone important, maybe the person throwing this whole event. Later, David would learn his name was Richard Westbrook, one of the wealthiest men in the city. The Westbrook Foundation was hosting this charity gala, which made Richard the host. But right now, David only knew that this man commanded the room with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in his entire life. David watched as various people approached Richard, shaking his hand, thanking him for the evening. A woman in a red dress said something about how generous the foundation was. A younger man praised Richard's business acumen. Everyone wanted his attention, his approval, but David's focus kept returning to the piano. It sat there untouched, waiting. He wondered if anyone would play it tonight. He wondered what it would feel like to sit on that bench, to let his fingers finally touch real keys instead of cardboard. Would the keys be smooth or slightly textured? Would they be heavy or light under his fingers? Would he remember everything he had practiced? A hand suddenly gripped his shoulder, making David jump. He spun around to find one of the hotel staff members, a man in a white jacket looking annoyed. "You lost, kid? This area is off limits to guests, and you're definitely not dressed like a guest." "I'm sorry," David stammered. "My mom works here tonight. I was just looking." The man's expression softened slightly but remained firm. "Well, looking time is over. Back to the break room now." David nodded quickly and hurried back the way he came, his heart pounding. But even as he walked away, the image of that piano burned in his mind, so close. It had been so close he could almost feel it. Back in the break room, David tried to return to his homework, but the numbers and equations made no sense now. All he could think about was that instrument sitting in the ballroom, probably not being played, just sitting there as decoration while people who didn't care about music walked past it. Time crawled by. 8 o'clock became 9. 9 became 10. His mother appeared briefly around 9:30, looking tired but saying everything was going fine. They were almost done with the main cleaning. The event was still going strong though, so she'd have to stay until the guests started leaving. Around 10:15, David heard a commotion in the hallway. Raised voices, something about the evening's entertainment. He peeked out and saw the event manager on his phone looking stressed. "What do you mean he can't make it?" the manager was saying. "The guests are expecting a performance. Mr. Westbrook specifically requested it." A pause. "An accident? Is he all right?" Another pause. Yes, I understand. We'll figure something out." The manager hung up and rubbed his temples, clearly frustrated. The pianist they had hired for the evening's entertainment had been in a minor car accident. Nothing serious, but he couldn't perform. Now they had a room full of wealthy donors who had been promised a musical performance and no performer. David's heart began to race. An idea formed in his mind, crazy and impossible. But ideas like this didn't listen to reason. They grew and pushed until they demanded action. The evening stretched on. David's mother came back around 11, saying they were finishing up and would leave soon. The guests were starting to head out. David nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He thought about all those nights practicing on cardboard, all those hours in the library watching videos and reading books, all that muscle memory built from thin air and hope. What was it all for if not for a moment like this? The reasonable part of his brain said to forget it. Stay invisible. Don't cause trouble. But another part, the part that lived and breathed music, whispered something different. Whispered that chances like this came once in a lifetime. Whispered that talent deserved a voice even if it came from the most unlikely place. David stood up from his chair. His legs felt shaky. He didn't have a plan exactly, but he knew that piano was in that ballroom, and it was calling to him, and if he didn't at least try to answer, he would regret it for the rest of his life. He walked back toward the ballroom, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. This time he wasn't just going to look. David's feet carried him forward before his brain could talk him out of it. The hallway seemed longer now, each step echoing in his ears. He could hear his own breathing, quick and shallow. His palms were sweating. Everything in his body screamed that this was a bad idea, that he should turn around, that boys like him didn't belong in rooms like that. But he kept walking. The ballroom had fewer people now than before. Maybe 30 or 40 guests remained, standing in small groups with drinks in their hands, chatting and laughing. The energy had shifted from the excitement of the evening's peak to the slower, more relaxed atmosphere of an event winding down. Some people were saying their goodbyes. Others lingered, not quite ready to leave. And there, still in the center of the room, sat the piano. Untouched. Waiting. David slipped through the service entrance, staying close to the wall. For a moment, nobody noticed him. He was just another face, another body in the room. His too small clothes made him look out of place, but in the dimmer lighting now that the dinner portion had ended, maybe he could blend in for just a few seconds. He walked toward the piano like someone in a dream. Each step felt unreal. His hands trembled at his sides. The polished floor reflected the chandelier lights, making it seem like he was walking on stars. The piano grew larger as he approached, more real, more solid than anything he had ever seen. When he reached it, David stopped. Up close, it was even more magnificent. The black surface was flawless. So perfectly polished he could see his own reflection staring back at him. A reflection of a skinny kid with messy hair and clothes that didn't fit right. But in that reflection, he also saw something else. He saw determination. He saw 2 years of practice. He saw every night spent with his cardboard keyboard. Every hour at the library, every dream he had refused to let go of. David reached out slowly. His fingers, calloused from pressing cardboard, touched the keys for the first time in his life. The ivory was cool and smooth under his fingertips. Solid. Real. He pressed down gently on middle C, and the sound that came out made his breath catch. It was perfect, pure. The note hung in the air like a small miracle, and David felt tears prick the corners of his eyes. This was what he had been dreaming about. This was the sound he had been imagining every single night. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice exploded across the room like a gunshot. David's hand jerked back from the keys as if they had burned him. His heart stopped. Every person in the ballroom turned to look. Richard Westbrook strode toward him, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. His expensive shoes clicked sharply against the floor. Behind him, several other guests followed, drawn by the commotion. David wanted to run, wanted to disappear, but his legs wouldn't move. He stood frozen, a deer in headlights. "How did you get in here?" Richard demanded, stopping a few feet away. He looked David up and down, taking in the cheap clothes, the worn sneakers, the obvious poverty. His lip curled with disgust. "Who let this street kid into my event?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. More people gathered, forming a circle around David and the piano. Someone whispered, "Is he one of the staff's children?" Another voice said, "Look at his clothes. Probably doesn't even know what a piano is." David's face burned with shame. This was a mistake, a terrible, horrible mistake. He should never have come here. Should never have thought someone like him could touch something so valuable. "I'm sorry," David managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. You just wanted to what?" Richard interrupted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Put your filthy hands all over an instrument worth more than your entire neighborhood? This piano cost more money than your family will see in 10 lifetimes. Do you have any idea how much damage you could have done?" A few people in the crowd laughed. Not kind laughter, but the cruel kind that cuts like broken glass. A woman in a silver dress said to her companion, "The audacity. These people have no respect for property." David's eyes stung. He wanted to explain, wanted to tell them that he did know what a piano was, that he had studied and practiced and dreamed of nothing else. But the words stuck in his throat. What was the point? They had already decided who he was. They had already judged him. Security appeared from somewhere, a large man in a black suit. He grabbed David's arm, not roughly but firmly. Come on, kid. Let's go. Across the room, David saw his mother emerge from a service door. Her face went pale when she saw what was happening. She rushed forward, horror and mortification written across her features. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice shaking as she addressed Richard Westbrook. He's my son. I brought him to wait while I worked. I didn't know he would. I'm so sorry. Please, we'll leave right now. She grabbed David's other arm, tears forming in her eyes. The shame on her face was worse than anything Richard Westbrook had said. David had embarrassed her, had put her job in jeopardy, had confirmed every terrible thing these rich people thought about them. You should teach your child some boundaries, a man in the crowd said coldly, some sense of what's appropriate. Maybe they need the money so badly she couldn't afford a babysitter, someone else commented, making it sound like an insult rather than the simple truth it was. David's mother was apologizing again, pulling him toward the exit when another voice cut through the noise. Wait, everyone turned. An elderly woman stepped forward from the crowd. She was small, maybe 5 feet tall, with white hair pulled back in an elegant bun. She wore a deep purple gown that looked expensive but understated, and her eyes were sharp and clear behind thin-framed glasses. Unlike everyone else, she didn't look angry or disgusted. She looked curious. Let the boy play, she said calmly. The room fell silent. Richard Westbrook stared at her in disbelief. Excuse me? I said, let the boy play. The woman's voice was soft but carried authority that made people listen. You're all so quick to judge, so certain you know everything about this child from a 30-second interaction. But none of you asked why he came to the piano. None of you wondered what brought him here. Mrs. Chen, with all due respect, Richard began, his tone slightly more measured now. This is not the time for one of your teaching moments. The boy clearly doesn't belong here. So this was Mrs. Chen. Even David, who knew almost nothing about the professional music world, had heard that name. Helen Chen was a legend. She had taught at the most prestigious conservatories in the world. Her students had won international competitions. She had been a concert pianist herself before becoming a teacher, and people said she could identify talent the way some people could identify colors. Doesn't belong? Mrs. Chen repeated, raising one eyebrow. She walked closer to David, studying his face. Tell me, child, why did you come to this piano? David's mouth was dry. Everyone was staring at him. His mother's grip on his arm tightened, probably willing him to just apologize and leave. But something in Mrs. Chen's eyes made him tell the truth. Because I've been practicing for 2 years, he said quietly, on cardboard. I drew a keyboard and practiced every night because I couldn't afford a real piano. I've never played a real one before. I just wanted to know what it felt like. Just once. The room was so quiet David could hear the chandelier crystals tinkling slightly from the air conditioning. Mrs. Chen's expression softened, something like recognition flickering across her face. On cardboard, she repeated. And what have you been practicing? What pieces? Chopin mostly, David said. Nocturnes. I watched videos at the library and taught myself to read music. I know I'm not good. I know I'm not like the students at the real music schools. But I try. I practice every day. Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, then turned to address Richard Westbrook in the crowd. I've been teaching music for 47 years. I've seen students from the wealthiest families. Children given every advantage, every resource. And do you know what the rarest quality is? Not talent. Not even discipline. It's passion. Real burning can't live without it. Passion. This boy taught himself music on cardboard. He practices without an instrument. That tells me everything I need to know. She looked back at David. Sit down. Play for us. Show them what 2 years of cardboard practice can do. Mrs. Chen, this is absurd, Richard protested. He'll embarrass himself. And probably damage the piano in the process. It's my piano, Richard, Mrs. Chen said calmly. I lent it to your foundation for this event, remember? And I say the boy plays, unless you want to argue with me. Richard's jaw tightened, but he stepped back. Nobody argued with Helen Chen. The security guard released David's arm. His mother looked terrified, but she let go too. The crowd waited. some looking annoyed at this interruption, others pulling out their phones. David realized with horror that people were getting ready to record this. To capture what they expected would be a humiliating disaster. His legs shook as he walked to the piano bench. Mrs. Chen gave him a small, encouraging nod. David sat down, the bench the perfect height, and suddenly everything else faded away. The crowd, the judgment, the fear, it all became background noise. His hands moved to the keys, finding their positions from muscle memory. Middle C, just like on his cardboard. The keys felt different than he had imagined, requiring more pressure, more intention, but his fingers knew what to do. They had practiced this 10,000 times. David closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. The first few notes came out tentative, uncertain. This was real. This was actually happening. The sound was almost overwhelming, richer and more complex than anything he had imagined during his silent practices. But as the melody began to flow, something remarkable happened. David's training took over. His fingers found their rhythm. The piece he had practiced countless times on cardboard began to come alive under his hands. It wasn't perfect. There were small mistakes, tiny hesitations where the real keys didn't respond exactly as he had imagined. But there was something else there too. Something that made Mrs. Chen's eyes widen. Something that made the mocking smiles around the room begin to fade. There was heart. David played like his life depended on it, because in a way, it did. Every note carried the weight of 2 years of dreaming. Every phrase told the story of a boy who refused to let poverty kill his passion. The music swelled and softened, dancing and mourning, exactly as Chopin had written it all those years ago. The ballroom had never been so quiet. The music filled every corner of the ballroom, weaving through the air like invisible threads, connecting David to something greater than himself. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, each note building on the last. The melody of Chopin's Nocturne rose and fell like waves, sometimes gentle and whispering, sometimes powerful and demanding to be heard. David forgot about the phones pointed at him, forgot about Richard Westbrook's angry face, forgot about his mother's worried eyes watching from the side. There was only the music now, only the conversation between his hands and the piano, between his heart and the notes that had lived in his imagination for so long. The piece moved into its middle section, where the left hand painted long, flowing phrases while the right hand sang the melody above. This was the part David had worried about most. On cardboard, he couldn't hear if his hands were balanced correctly, couldn't know if one was too loud or too soft. But something instinctive took over. His years of watching videos, of studying how real pianists moved their bodies and shifted their weight. All of that knowledge lived in his muscles now. Around the room, the atmosphere shifted like weather changing. The woman in the silver dress who had laughed earlier now stood completely still, her champagne glass forgotten in her hand. The man who had talked about teaching boundaries had his arms crossed but was leaning forward, listening. Even Richard Westbrook, who had been red-faced with anger moments before, now wore an expression that was harder to read. Confusion, maybe, or the first hints of something else. Mrs. Chen stood nearest to the piano, her hands clasped in front of her chest. Tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, but she was smiling. She had heard thousands of students play over her decades of teaching. She had listened to prodigies and professionals, to the talented and the merely technical. But there was something about this performance that reached past all her experience and training, straight to the part of her that had first fallen in love with music as a little girl. It was raw, imperfect, but it was real. David reached the climax of the piece, where the melody builds to its emotional peak, before slowly descending back down like autumn leaves falling. His hands stretched across the keys, finding intervals that should have been impossible for someone who had never played a real piano before. But he had prepared for this, had visualized it so many times that his fingers knew the distance, knew the reach. A woman near the back of the crowd put her hand over her mouth. She whispered to the person next to her. He taught himself. On cardboard. Did you hear what he said? The final section of the Nocturne approached, where Chopin asks the pianist to play with the most delicate touch, the softest dynamics. This was where many students failed, unable to control the piano at such quiet volumes. But David, who had spent 2 years pressing silent keys, who had learned to hear the music only in his mind, understood something about quietness that others had to be taught. He played the ending so softly it was almost a whisper. The notes floated in the air like snowflakes, each one precious and temporary. The final chord hung suspended for a moment, and then David lifted his hands from the keys and let the silence settle. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then the applause started. It began with Mrs. Chen, who clapped her hands together firmly, decisively. Then another person joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom erupted in applause, not the polite, obligatory clapping that had filled the room earlier during speeches and toasts. This was different. This was genuine. People weren't just clapping. Some were cheering. Several were wiping tears from their eyes. David sat frozen on the bench, unable to process what was happening. His hand still hovered over the keys, trembling now from the release of adrenaline. Had that really just happened? Had he actually played? The sound of applause seemed to come from very far away, like he was underwater. Mrs. Chen moved forward and placed her hand on David's shoulder. "Breathe, child," she said gently. "You did it." David turned to look at her, and the tears he had been holding back finally spilled over. "Was it okay?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Did I mess up too badly?" Mrs. Chen laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Mess up, my dear boy, that was extraordinary. Yes, there were technical imperfections. Your tempo wavered in places. Some notes weren't as clean as they could be. But do you know what you had that I can't teach? Soul. You played with your whole heart." More people approached now, the crowd that had been so hostile just minutes ago now pushing forward with completely different energy. A man in a gray tuxedo reached out to shake David's hand. "Young man, that was remarkable. Truly remarkable." The woman in the silver dress, the one who had made the cruel comment about respect for property, now looked embarrassed. She didn't approach, but David saw her say something to her companion, shaking her head as if ashamed of herself. David's mother finally reached him, pushing through the small crowd. She pulled him into a tight hug, her whole body shaking. "Baby, I don't even know what to say. I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me you could do that?" "I didn't know if I really could," David admitted into her shoulder. "I've never played a real piano before today." She pulled back, holding his face in her hands, looking at him like she was seeing him for the first time. "You've been practicing? All this time on what?" "Cardboard," David said almost apologetically. "I drew a keyboard. I'm sorry I didn't tell you. I didn't want you to worry about one more thing you couldn't afford." His mother's face crumpled, fresh tears streaming down. But she was smiling too, laughing and crying at the same time. "Oh, David, my sweet boy, you never have to apologize for having a dream." Richard Westbrook approached slowly, his earlier anger replaced by something that looked like reluctant respect. He cleared his throat. "Young man, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions. Very wrong assumptions." David didn't know what to say to that. Part of him wanted to accept the apology graciously. Another part, a smaller but angrier part, wanted to point out that Richard had been cruel, had tried to humiliate him in front of everyone. But before he could respond, Mrs. Chen spoke up. "Richard, your apology is noted, but apologies are just words. Let's talk about actions." She turned her full attention to David. "What's your name, child?" "David, ma'am." "David, I run a music academy. The best in this city, some would say in this country. My students go on to perform in concert halls around the world, to teach at universities, to become the next generation of great musicians. I want you to come study with me." The room went quiet again. Even for people who didn't know much about music, the weight of this offer was clear. Helen Chen didn't make offers like this lightly. David's heart hammered in his chest. "I can't afford lessons, ma'am. We barely afford rent." "Did I say anything about money?" Mrs. Chen replied, raising an eyebrow. "I'm offering you a full scholarship. Lessons with me personally. Access to our practice rooms and instruments. Everything you need. The only cost is your dedication, and you've already proven you have that in abundance." David's mother gasped. "Mrs. Chen, that's too generous. We couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Mrs. Chen interrupted firmly but kindly. "I don't make offers I don't mean. This boy has something special. I've spent my whole life identifying talent, and I'm telling you, he has it. Raw and untrained, yes, but it's there, and it would be a crime to let it go to waste because of something as silly as money." A younger man in the crowd, someone David didn't recognize, stepped forward. He wore an expensive suit and had the kind of confidence that came from success. "Mrs. Chen is right, and I'd like to contribute as well. I own a piano store downtown. David, I'll arrange for a piano to be delivered to your home. Nothing as grand as this one, but a good quality upright that you can practice on. And I'll cover the delivery and tuning costs, another woman added. She wore a red dress and had kind eyes. Plus, I'd like to set up a small fund for any other expenses. Sheet music, books, whatever you need for your education. More offers came, people almost competing now to be part of David's story. Someone pledged to cover transportation costs to and from lessons. Another offered to pay for performance clothes for recitals. Richard Westbrook, perhaps trying to redeem himself, announced that his foundation would create a scholarship fund named in David's honor to help other talented young people from underprivileged backgrounds access music education. David stood in the center of it all, overwhelmed and slightly dizzy. Just an hour ago, he had been sitting in a break room doing homework. Now his entire life was changing in real time. Everything he had dreamed about, practiced for, hoped for in his quietest moments was becoming real. But something bothered him. A thought that pushed its way through all the excitement and generous offers. "Mrs. Chen," David said quietly, and the room settled down to hear him. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, dear. If I hadn't played well just now, would you still have offered to help me?" The question hung in the air. Mrs. Chen studied him carefully, understanding what he was really asking. He wanted to know if people's kindness was conditional, if it only came when you proved yourself worthy. If boys like him only mattered when they had something spectacular to offer. Mrs. Chen took a long moment before answering. "That's a profound question, David, and I'll be honest with you. Many people in this room tonight wouldn't have noticed you at all if you hadn't played beautifully. That's the truth about the world we live in. It's not fair. It's not right. But it's reality." She paused, then continued. "However, I can tell you this. The moment you said you'd been practicing on cardboard for 2 years before you even played a single note, I knew I wanted to help you, because that told me everything about your character, your determination, your love for music. The performance confirmed what I already suspected. So yes, David, even if you had played poorly, I would have offered you my help, because talent can be developed, but passion like yours is rare." David nodded slowly, processing this. The answer wasn't perfect. The world wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and somehow that mattered more than empty reassurances would have. His mother squeezed his hand. "What do you say, baby? Is this what you want?" David looked around the ballroom one more time, at the piano that had been both his dream and his fear, at the faces of people who had judged him and then changed their minds, at Mrs. Chen, who saw something in him worth nurturing, at his mother who had worked herself to exhaustion to give him even the small life they had. "Yes," he said, his voice stronger now. "Yes, this is what I want." The applause started again, but gentler this time, congratulatory, celebratory. And as the crowd began to disperse, already pulling out phones to share the video of his performance that would soon spread far beyond this ballroom, David sat back down at the piano. He played one more note. Just middle C, the first note he had ever learned. The foundation of everything. It rang out clear and true, a promise of all the music yet to come. 3 days after the gala, David woke up to the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway outside their apartment. His mother was already awake, pacing nervously by the window. She had barely slept since Saturday night, still processing everything that had happened. Neither of them had quite believed it was real until Mrs. Chen called on Sunday to confirm the scholarship and scheduled David's first lesson for the following week. Now it was Tuesday morning, and the piano store owner had kept his promise. 2 delivery men carefully maneuvered an upright piano through their narrow doorway. The instrument was made of rich mahogany wood, not as grand as the Steinway from the gala, but beautiful in its own right. David and his mother pressed themselves against the wall to make room as the men guided it into their tiny living room. "Where do you want it?" one of the men asked, surveying the cramped space. There wasn't much choice. The living room barely fit their old couch and small television. David's mother pointed to the wall opposite the window. "There, I guess. We'll move the bookshelf." It took another 20 minutes to position everything, but finally the piano sat against the wall, dominating the small room. After the delivery men left, David and his mother just stood there staring at it. "It's really here," his mother whispered. "In our home." David approached slowly, almost afraid to touch it, afraid this might all be a dream he was about to wake up from. But when his fingers pressed the keys, the sound was real, solid, true. He played a simple scale, and the notes filled their apartment with a richness that made his cardboard keyboard seem like a distant memory from another lifetime. His mother sat on the couch, watching him with an expression that mixed pride and sadness. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. David turned to look at her. "Sorry for what?" "For not being able to give you this sooner. For not even knowing you wanted it. I've been so focused on just keeping us afloat that I missed what was happening right in front of me. You've been dreaming this whole time and I didn't see it." David left the piano and sat beside her, taking her hand. "Mom, you gave me everything that mattered. You worked 2 jobs so I could have food and a place to sleep. You kept me safe. That's what let me have space to dream in the first place. This piano, these lessons, they're amazing. But they wouldn't mean anything if you hadn't been there keeping everything together." She pulled him into a hug, holding on tight. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," he said, and she laughed through her tears. The first lesson with Mrs. Chen happened on Thursday afternoon. David's mother took time off from her morning job to accompany him, even though he insisted he could take the bus alone. She wanted to see where he'd be spending his time, wanted to meet the woman who was giving her son this incredible opportunity. Mrs. Chen's academy was in a renovated mansion in the historic district. The building had tall columns out front and large windows that let in streams of natural light. Inside, the walls were decorated with photographs of famous musicians and framed concert programs. David could hear piano music coming from various practice rooms, a symphony of scales and etudes and classical pieces all blending together. Mrs. Chen met them in her office, a cozy room lined with books and sheet music. She shook David's mother's hand warmly. "You've raised a remarkable young man. You should be very proud." "I am," his mother said, "and I can't thank you enough for this opportunity. I still can't quite believe it's real." "It's very real," Mrs. Chen assured her, "and I want you both to understand something. This won't be easy. David has natural talent and incredible dedication, but he's starting later than most of my students and has gaps in his technical foundation that we'll need to address. There will be frustration. Times when progress feels slow, times when he might want to quit." She looked at David directly. "Are you ready for that? For the hard work that comes after the magical moment?" David nodded without hesitation. "I've been waiting my whole life for the chance to do hard work like this." Mrs. Chen smiled. "Good answer. Let's begin." The first real lesson was humbling. Mrs. Chen started with basics, proper posture, hand position, how to sit at the bench, things David had tried to learn from videos but never had anyone to correct. She was patient but exacting, adjusting the curve of his fingers, the angle of his wrists, explaining why every small detail mattered. "You've built some habits we'll need to reshape," she said, not unkindly. "Your performance at the gala was remarkable, but if you want to reach your full potential, we need to go back to fundamentals. Are you okay with that?" "Yes, ma'am," David said. Going backward to move forward made sense to him. He wasn't afraid of starting over if it meant doing things right. They worked on a single scale for almost an hour, just C major up and down over and over. Mrs. Chen listened with her eyes closed, catching every imperfection, every note that wasn't quite even, every moment where his fingers tensed instead of staying relaxed. It was harder than playing the nocturne had been, more demanding in a different way. But David loved every minute of it. Over the next few weeks, David's life transformed in ways both wonderful and challenging. He went to school during the day, but now his backpack was heavy with music theory books and sheet music. During lunch, instead of sitting alone, he found himself talking with other students who had seen the video of his performance. It had gone viral online, shared thousands of times with captions like, "Poor boy stuns rich people with hidden talent," and "Never judge someone by their appearance." Some of the attention was good. His music teacher, Mr. Patterson, practically glowed with pride and started featuring David's story in his classes as inspiration. Other students treated him with new respect, asking about his lessons, wanting to hear him play. But some attention was uncomfortable. A few kids accused him of showing off. Someone started a rumor that the whole thing had been staged for internet fame. A girl in his math class said loudly that she didn't see what the big deal was, that plenty of people could play piano. David learned to ignore the noise. He had something more important to focus on. 3 evenings a week, he took the bus across town to Mrs. Chen's academy for lessons. The other students there were different from him. They wore expensive clothes, carried professional-grade instrument cases, talked casually about summer programs in Europe and competitions in other states. At first, David felt out of place, like he was playing dress-up in a world where he didn't belong. But Mrs. Chen treated all her students the same during lesson time. Talent and dedication mattered. Everything else was just noise. The piano in his apartment became the center of his world. Every morning before school, David practiced for an hour. Every evening after homework, another 2 hours. His mother complained jokingly that she couldn't hear the television anymore, over the sound of scales and arpeggios. But David noticed she was smiling more these days, humming along sometimes when he played something beautiful. Money was still tight. His mother still worked 2 jobs. Their apartment was still small and the neighborhood still rough. But something fundamental had shifted. They had hope now, a path forward that didn't exist before. 2 months after the gala, Mrs. Chen entered David into his first small competition, a local event for young pianists. He was nervous, competing against kids who had been taking lessons since they were 5 years old, who had years of performance experience. David didn't win. He placed 3rd out of 8 competitors, but Mrs. Chen was thrilled. "Do you understand what you just did?" she said afterward, beaming. "You've been taking formal lessons for 8 weeks. 8 weeks, and you placed in a competition against students who've trained for years. That's not just talent, David. That's proof that your dedication all those nights with your cardboard piano built something real." 6 months in, David performed in his first recital at the academy. His mother sat in the front row, wearing a dress she had borrowed from a coworker because she wanted to look nice for the occasion. When David walked onto the small stage and sat at the piano, his hands didn't shake anymore. This was where he belonged. He played a Mozart sonata that Mrs. Chen had assigned him, and then, as a surprise encore, he played Chopin's Nocturne. The same piece from the gala, but this time it was different, cleaner, more controlled. The technical imperfections had been smoothed out through months of careful practice. Yet somehow it still carried that same emotional truth, that same heart that had made people cry that first night. The audience applauded warmly, and when David stood to bow, he caught his mother's eye. She was crying again, but this time they were purely happy tears. 1 year after the gala, Richard Westbrook's foundation held its annual charity event again. This time David was invited as a guest, not as the son of a cleaning crew member. He wore a suit that had been donated to the scholarship fund, and he sat at a table with Mrs. Chen and several of her other students. But the biggest change came when Richard Westbrook stood to make an announcement. "Last year, something unexpected happened at this event that changed my perspective on talent, privilege, and opportunity. A young man named David reminded all of us that genius can come from anywhere, and that our job as people with resources is to find it and nurture it, not to judge it based on appearances." He gestured to David, and the spotlight found him in the crowd. David felt his face flush but managed a small wave. The scholarship fund we created in David's name has now helped 15 other young musicians access training they otherwise couldn't afford. And tonight I'm announcing that we're expanding the program to include visual arts, dance, and theater, because David taught us that talent doesn't wait for permission. It doesn't wait for the right circumstances. It just needs someone to believe in it and give it a chance to grow. The room erupted in applause. David's mother, sitting next to him, squeezed his hand so hard it hurt, but he didn't mind. Later that evening, after the speeches and the dinner and the networking, David found himself alone for a moment in the same ballroom where everything had changed. The same piano sat in the center of the room. He walked over to it, trailing his fingers across the polished surface. "Go ahead," a voice said behind him. Mrs. Chen had appeared quietly, as she had a habit of doing. "Play something." David sat down at the bench, feeling the weight of how much had changed in a year. He thought about the cardboard keyboard folded up in his closet at home, which he kept as a reminder. He thought about all the practice hours, the frustrations, the small victories. He thought about his mother's sacrifices and Mrs. Chen's belief in him and the unexpected kindness of strangers, who could have stayed cruel but chose differently. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not Chopin this time, something new, a piece he was working on by Debussy. The notes flowed out, filling the ballroom with music that was technically better than what he'd played a year ago, but still carried that same essential quality that had made people stop and listen, because David had learned something important over the past year. Technique was crucial. Training was necessary. But what made music matter, what made it reach people's hearts, was the truth you put into it. The story you told with every note. And David's story, the story of a poor boy with a cardboard piano and an impossible dream that somehow came true, was worth telling. Not because it was unique, but because it was universal. Everyone had something they dreamed about, something they practiced for in secret, something they hoped might someday be recognized and valued. David's gift to the world wasn't just his music. It was the reminder that dreams don't die just because circumstances are hard. They wait, they persist. And sometimes if you're brave enough to reach for them even when everyone says you shouldn't, even when it seems ridiculous to try, those dreams reach back. The final chord resonated through the ballroom and David smiled. This was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, more moments of doubt. But he wasn't the same scared 12-year-old who had touched a piano for the first time in this room. He was a musician now, and his song was just beginning to be heard.